Welcome to another edition of A Voice to the Gentile Church. I'm Jim Wingerter. Next to me is Pastor Roger Diaz. Next to him is Dolores Lowe. So, Dolores, Israel released a report.
Yes. So Israel released their initial report on the Hamas sexual violence on October 7th, right?
Yes.
And it is absolutely horrific. I mean, I'm not even going to discuss what the report had. People can go find out on their own. But it is so horrific that I can't even call them animals because animals don't behave this way.
Right.
And the thing that is so shocking is you remember the Me Too movement, right? Oh, Me Too, let's save women, blah, 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 right? Do you hear any of those voices? None of those voices.
Right.
Even the UN 3 weeks ago, had some special day dealing with women and sexual abuse and totally ignored what the Israeli women have gone through.
Right.
It's absolutely horrible. And it goes to illustrate how this was not about resistance. This was not about trying to create a Palestinian state. This was about killing and harming Jews. Mm-hmm. That's what it was all about.
Striking terror was strictly terrorism. It was to strike terror, and it's amazing that the UN came out and said that Hamas is not a terrorist group, but a political movement. But that whole sequence of events that occurred that morning was all about striking terror into the hearts of Israel. So how could they not be a terrorist organization?
Right.
Well, we're surprised the UN would respond in such a way, the den of vipers.
Mm. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're horrible people, and I can't even talk about it. And just to see, in Spanish we have a saying that says, tell me who you're with and I'll tell you who you are. That's what it really means. So let's go listen.
How does it go in Spanish?
Dime con quién andas y te diré quién eres. So
has a ring to it.
Yeah. So we go to Brazil, where there's this guy named Lula da Silva, right? You remember him, the one who cheated to become president of Brazil.
Okay.
Yeah. So he was out speaking, putting his foot in his mouth, basically. He compared the Israel's Gaza war with the Holocaust, right? So right away, ignoring all the evil that Gaza has done, right? That the Palestinians have done, and comparing it to the Holocaust, and then defended Putin killing Navalny, right? And I'm like, as I was telling you guys before the show began, I'm so grateful that God is patient, but every once in a while you want that lightning bolt to just drop down and strike somebody, because this guy is like exhibit number 1 for that, right?
Well, he's in there wrongfully. I mean, when I say wrongfully, he cheated, like you said, in a most brazen way to become president a second time. But it really was about getting Bolsonaro out. Yes. Bolsonaro was too conservative. He was too right of center for him to remain the president of Brazil, because Brazil, wherever you find a socialist leftist government, you have corruption.
Right.
Wherever you have a more right to center government, you have less corruption. So it's about corruption. And I know Brazilians, and I speak to them about Da Silva, and he is very close to senility right now. I mean, he can barely get up and speak.
Must be a trend, because we have that.
Yeah, no, he is. From what I understand, he's not well. But his wife is actually the clout behind the throne. She's the mover and the shaker. She is in that whole administration, and she's very powerful. The people that I know say that she's involved in the occult. And wherever she goes, she has these occultists with her and with him. So he's not his own man. He's very much like Biden. He's sort of a shadow of Biden almost. Don't think that there isn't occultic activity behind Biden. Don't think that at all. There is.
Yeah.
And then Bibi really addressed Lula da Silva strongly, right? What did he came right out and I like what he said at the end of his talk about da Silva. He said, "You should be ashamed." And the reason he said that is because Lula da Silva, when his first administration, He went to Israel, and there were Brazilian flags everywhere, and he declared that he descended from the Sephardim, Beni Anusim. And he made that declaration, and they loved, hey, look at this, we have a Beni Anusim president of Brazil, Beni Anusim, those descended from the coerced. And now he's there lashing out against Israel. And that's why Bibi said, you should be ashamed. And he should be ashamed. But I don't think he's his own man anymore. I don't think he thinks for himself. I don't think he thinks at all.
Well, so you're absolutely right. So what people don't remember is he was not supposed to be able to even run for office because he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
He should have been in jail.
You're right. And he went to court and everything. And by Brazilian law, if you've been convicted, you can't run. But somehow, miraculously, the Supreme Court in Brazil exempted him from
corruption. Corruption. That's all this. Bolsonaro, when he fled Brazil, he came here to Orlando.
Yep.
And he was hiding out on the Brazilian side of town. And he had to go back to Brazil. And now, like you said earlier, he's not allowed to leave Brazil, and they're hunting him out.
Yep.
He's in hiding. They want to kill him.
Yep. Totalitarian government.
They tried to kill him, Bolsonaro, when he was president. Mm-hmm. It's the same. Brazil is hankering to be a corrupt nation, and that's because of the leftist government.
It just amazes me because everywhere where there's a leftist government in power, there's fraud, there's poverty, there's corruption.
Run amok.
Yeah, and I don't understand how.
They're strong believers in Brazil. Brazil is a very important country in terms of the kingdom of God. Very important. Rabbis are flocking to Brazil from Israel to engage in the reversion of Beni Anusim by the thousands. The things that I said would happen 20 years ago is now happening, and it's a powerful movement. So Israel, I'm really glad that Israel has come to terms with that. There's near 55 million Beni Anusim in Brazil, and many of them are wanting to revert back to their ancestral faith. That's a powerful thing. So, and then you have also at the same time in Brazil many true believers in Messiah that are powerful, and so keep your eyes on Brazil.
Yep. So on a lighter note for the Middle East, the son of Hamas, the son of the founder of Hamas,
Mossad, what's his name?
Yeah, let me pull it up.
His name is Mossad. I think that's funny.
Mossab Hassan Youssef.
Okay, Hassan Youssef.
Yeah. Who has been very vocal anti-Hamas, right? It's amazing, his father being who his father was. He's very anti-Hamas. And today, he called this week for Egypt to permit the Gazans to go through the border into Egypt, because that would get all those, quote, civilians out of the way so that the IDF could come in and totally destroy
It's too
Hamas.
practical and makes too much sense.
They don't want them.
Right, exactly.
They flat out don't want them. Nobody talks about this. The Egyptians, who are not very scrupulous people to begin with, see those Palestinian refugees as the plague of death.
Yep.
I mean, let's be honest. The Arab nations, including Egypt's not an Arab nation, but all of the Arab nations, including, the Muslim nations, they want those people in the land. Those people are plugs. They're pawns, and
gives them
why
an
would
excuse.
It would be counterproductive on the part of Islam to have them return to Egypt, because many of them are, in fact, Egyptians to begin with.
Yep. So, and then on a interesting note in the United States, so there was a case in Alabama where two couples were in the process of in vitro fertilization, and they had created embryos, and those embryos were frozen. There was kind of an accident at the facility that was holding the embryos, and the temperature rose, the embryos died. So these two couples...
So the babies died.
The babies died, yes, thank you. You're absolutely correct. So these two couples went to court to receive redress for that. The company was claiming that these weren't babies, right? You know how the left likes to. So interestingly enough, there is a law in Alabama that was written in 1872 that allows parents to sue over the wrongful death of their children, right? So the whole premise, the parents were saying these were our children and they were killed through the neglect of these people.
If medically they're not capable of doing it again and producing embryos again, then they did kill their children.
Right. And the company was saying, oh, no, those aren't children. So the Alabama Supreme Court finally ruled on it yesterday, and the ruling is that an unborn child is a child no matter where that child is, even if it's extrauterine, right? They also, and I thought this was beautiful, they said, even before birth, all human beings have the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory. That's what the Chief Justice wrote in his concurring opinion. It was an 8-1 ruling, so very, very solid ruling. Only one judge dissented, right?
Makes you go, who's the schmuck?
Yes, exactly. So now the left has lost their mind, including Karine Pierre-Jones, right? You know, she can't speak on anything, but she spoke on this because they're now claiming that this is going to be harmful to IVF, because you know that in IVF,
tell our listeners what IVF is.
In vitro fertilization. So that's where they take the egg and the sperm and they unite them outside of the body, create the embryo, and then they will put the embryo in the woman's womb and it'll grow, right? But usually they do like 6 embryos.
Right.
And then they do selective reduction.
Because they don't all adhere to the wall of the uterus.
Right.
Right.
Now, there are a few doctors who do not do that, right? There are very few doctors who do not do like 6 embryos. They'll do maybe 2. And those are families that don't want selective reduction, right? So, but the majority of IVF medical practices will do 6 embryos or more and do the selective reduction and won't even take you as a patient if you don't agree to that. So now Karine Pierre-Jones was saying how this is going to be horrible for IVF because now when you do the selective reduction, you're killing a child and it's all going on, right? But I think it's nice to see that there is at least one state in the U.S. who has a very clear-cut understanding of what a human being is and the fact that the human being is an image bearer of God, right?
Yep.
Well, it's shaking the cage.
Yep, absolutely.
That whole IVF thing, I don't know where I stand on that. I'm not comfortable with that at all. But, you know, it's good that Alabama would take a stand like that. It's great.
So on good news.
There is some.
So we all know that Javier Milei got elected in Argentina as president.
You talked about that the last time we met. Yeah. You mentioned that he was a solid conservative and he was doing good for the economy.
And he's an economist, and obviously a good economist, because in the matter of 3 months, he has managed to deliver the first budget surplus in Argentina in 12 years.
Yeah, we were commenting before we started the show that it's been since Eva Perón.
Yes.
Since Argentine government has ruled with justice.
Yep. So
they've been a leftist nation for 40 years.
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
And so wherever you find the left, you'll find corruption and thievery and all that stuff.
So Argentina has a $44 billion debt to the International Monetary Fund, which is the bank that funds that kind of stuff, which is a lot for a state like Argentina, right? Their GDP can't support that. So he came in, like he said he was going to do, he cut a bunch of, bureaucracy, got rid of people, it's like the U.S., right? Our government services people are a humongous number of people, right? So the unions, the government employees are losing their minds, but he delivered a $540 million surplus, right? Which goes a long way to helping Argentina to get back on track.
Right.
So that was good news. And then super good news for Dale, because he always complains that I always have bad news.
But in regards to Milei,
yes,
Javier, or as they say in Portuguese, Xavier, he went to Israel.
Yes, he did. He was at the wall.
2 weekends ago, he was. So 2 Shabbats ago, he went to the wall. And that was one of the first places he went. I think he arrived on Thursday, so Friday he was at the wall. And he started praying at the wall, and I don't think he expected this to happen. He had one of those moments that myself and others have, where you something just reaches out and grabs a hold of you. And he stood there and he wept for like 10 minutes on the Shabbat. He came away from the wall, and of course, here is this president from Argentina. Argentina has never stood with Israel. In fact, Argentina has historically been hostile towards Israel. So here is this new president from Argentina. He's doing a really good job. He comes to Israel. He weeps at the wall for 10 minutes. He dances with everyone. They hoist him up and they dance with him. And he did Shabbat. Then he came back to the wall on Sunday morning, more formally attired. And he did the same thing again. He went to the wall and he just poured himself out emotionally at the wall. And by then, he's a superstar in Israel, right?
Yes.
So he went to Yad Vashem that night, Sunday night, and in Spanish, he talked about the third temple and the restoration of Israel and how important the prophecies are concerning the restoration of Israel, building of the third temple. And they asked him what he prayed about at the wall. He said, well, I'm praying for Argentina, I'm praying for my people, and I'm praying for Israel. So that night is when the two Argentinian hostages were released.
Yep.
And that's amazing. The same night, a mere 3 or 4 hours later, the Israeli army gets in there and they find these two Argentinians and they release them. And so that's amazing.
Yep.
That's the hand of God. And who's God speaking to? Well, he's speaking to Israel, but he's also speaking to the nations. I mean, that's a clear denotation that he's with this guy. Mm-hmm. And he's probably also saying that that's the right ideology, the ideology or the mindset of Javier Milei is what's correct.
Right.
Maybe the nations will take note of it. It's kind of God lifting up a standard for the nations and saying, you see, look at what has happened. But Israel received most of that message because they're just amazed by the outpouring of love from the nations. Yep. Micronesia and all these other nations sending their support. A contingency last week, of indigenous peoples from around the world went to Jerusalem and established their embassy in Jerusalem. Indigenous peoples from this country, South America, the Pacific Ocean, Indonesia, and all those areas, even New Zealand was represented. I'm not sure about Hawaii, but indigenous peoples, they went to Jerusalem. They established their own embassy in Jerusalem. So this is an important thing that's happening right now, and the people that love Israel, they're just pouring out their love right now. And this is very, very powerful for Israel.
Well, it's critical at this point because the big nations of the West, right?
Just rejecting them.
Yeah. Like I read an article today where England is debating whether to cease selling arms to Israel now. And I'm like...
Well, that will happen. Even this country will eventually go that route. The Congress is leaning left a lot. So I think it's only a matter of time before our Congress do the same.
Well, and so the State Department today came out and said that their end goal is two-state solution, right? Yeah. That's what they said.
And when Israel determinedly says, no, we're not doing a two-state solution, that's when we would begin to put pressure on them. But right now, Bibi is standing firm, but he's, as of today, he's beginning to show signs of wanting to make a deal. He's standing firm, but just today, I'm talking a few hours ago, he made some statements that seems to illustrate that he's willing to bend. So we'll see how that goes.
Well, that's not good. That in the end, that means more people will die later.
Right. Exactly.
No, he's firm on that, but not so firm on if the United States were to pull back their support, would they be able to carry on? I see what you're saying. Yeah. So if the U.S. and the UK decides that we're going to pull back our support, then Israel will have no choice. I think that's how Bibi is seeing it.
But one of the things that was proven by this war and the Ukrainian war is that you can make some real damage with really small weapons, right? Because both Hamas and Ukraine have both been relying on drones to deliver their damage. To the point where Russian tanks have been destroyed by a simple couple of $100 drone with some explosives attached to it, right? So hopefully, Israel is very smart, so hopefully they have gotten that. Now, in our Congress, I was in D.C. last week, and what you just said, one of the congressmen actually said it to me.
What
If
is?
we stop right now,
Oh.
this will only have to happen again later,
Right.
right?
Right.
But we
And
have
it's worse later.
Exactly. And we have a small contingent in both the House and the Senate that are rabid pro-Israel, right? One of the congressmen there's a bunch of congressmen with "We Stand with Israel" signs hanging outside their offices. There's a couple of them that have the Israeli flag outside their office. But there's an awful lot of those leftists that are, and
In
those
Michigan.
that are quiet, right?
And Michigan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's going to be tough.
I was hoping that the Ukraine situation will continue to fizzle out, but now with the latest developments in Russia, we now have the drive and the impetus to continue the conflict in the Ukraine. So it makes me wonder about that assassination.
Yeah, they're using Navalny now, the death of Navalny, to justify the need for additional funding, and people feel that, we have to give them additional funding because look how
Because
terrible
of
this
yeah.
is.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, yeah.
You never know.
Yeah. So on a brighter note, you went to Florida State, didn't you?
I did.
You do know that Florida State is the number 2 party school in the nation, right?
I knew it when I was there.
Number one is
I don't know, but Florida State is number 2.
Probably University of
Central
Miami.
Florida.
So, interesting enough, the number 2 party school in Florida saw mass baptisms this past week
Huh.
in the school fountain. So you should know what this fountain is.
Yeah, it's up in front of the administration building.
So there was a worship service, and then after that, they had like 400 kids go into the fountain.
We always dump palm olive in it.
Westcott Fountain, that's
Westcott
what it's called.
Fountain.
Yeah. And they had this massive number of students being baptized, similar to what happened at Auburn a few months ago, right?
In
So,
Kentucky.
You can see that polarization happening, right?
Yeah.
It's coming. It's so clear. And people have got to get on one side or the other of the line because there's not going to be a middle.
North Florida, there has been an anointing in North Florida for a few years. So maybe it's reached over to the university.
Yep. So, and that's my news for today.
All right. We have
All
a
right.
question.
We have a question, and the question, I'll read the question.
Okay.
Will there be another exodus of Jews to the land of Israel? Question. If so, when does it occur, and how can we prepare for it? So, that's a couple questions in there. All right. So yes, I think the short answer is yes. There's going to be an exodus, and that exodus has begun, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So we should go to the Bible. In Isaiah chapter 11, God makes a declaration that we ought to bring to light right now. And I'll read it in chapter 11. I'm going to read 10 to 12. Then in that day, so it's not real clear about what day it's referring to. We'll get to that in a moment. Then in that day, so it's referring to a specific day, the nations will restore to the root of Jesse. Who is the root of Jesse?
Jesus.
Right, the Zemach, who will stand as a signal. The King James says ensign. The word there is nes in Hebrew. And the word nes is a banner, or like it says here, a signal, but the word banner is more appropriate. So, who will stand as a banner, a nes, a signal for the peoples. His resting place will be glorious. So this is referring to the time of restoration. It's pointing to that time when the root of Jesse, Yeshua, will be established. His ministry, his rule will be established in it, because it says at the end of that verse that his resting place, the place of his shakan, the place of his dwelling, which can only be the Mishkan, where he will dwell, place will be glorious, and that's quite appropriate because the glory of God, the word glorious there is connected to the word kavod. And the glory of God will come with Yeshua. Well, he will bring the glory when he comes. And we know where he's going, to his resting place, which is Jerusalem. But then in verse 11, then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain in Assyria, who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Patros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and from the islands of the sea. So he'll bring his people back the second time. What's he talking about? Was there a first time? Was there a first ingathering? Well, of course, we're talking about Ezra, Nehemiah. That ingathering, that it was sort of a partial ingathering. Yes, God did bring them back once from the Babylonian exile. So Isaiah here is pointing to a time when there will be a second ingathering. But what's different about this ingathering is it points to a time when the standard, the nest will be raised up for all the nations. And that will be the time of his resting place, his Shekan, his place where he will Shekan. So he'll bring them back from all the nations, from one end of the earth to the next, according to what we see in Jesus' Olivet Discourse. So in verse 12 now, and he will lift up a standard. There's that word again. So the King James uses ensign in both cases. The New American Standard, for some reason, uses signal in verse 10, but then standard in verse 12. It's the same word in Hebrew, nes. So he will raise up a standard. And he will lift up a standard for the nations. They assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth.
So is this once Jesus is in Jerusalem?
It's the same time. So it's simultaneous.
Okay.
It's the same period. When he lifts up this standard, this nest, this basically a flag, you can say, for the nations, at that time he will bring them back and restore them. So you can say that the completion of this process will be when he lifts up that standard. Again, in the text from verse 10 to 12, the word nes is used twice. And that's for a good reason, because God is lifting up a standard. A banner is another word that can be used. A banner for all the nations to know that it is the time of redemption. You might say that the banner is Jesus. Well, yes, but the banner really is his work. The work of Messiah is to bring Israel back to God. We see that in Isaiah chapter 49. Very clearly, God's chief servant is to restore Israel to God. And that's also the work of the church, which will bring us to the conclusion here in a few moments. So, there is this reality of a second ingathering. And that's kind of where we are today. We're seeing an ingathering that's completely separate and remote from the very first one. The very first ingathering, again, began with Cyrus, right? Cyrus was that great king who declared that Jerusalem would be rebuilt and the people of Israel will return. And he initiated that process, but that was not a complete ingathering. We know, of course, that later on, they had the Romans. The Romans did what they did. So, now, we ought to mention here that God stated very clearly at Mount Sinai to Israel that should they rebel against him, should they break his Sabbaths, should they defile his temple, should they engage in idolatry, he would chastise them strongly if they do not repent. And first of all, in chapter 26 of Leviticus, he said, if you do these things, you'll be blessed. You know, your enemies will flee from you. You will have more than enough. Your vats will be full. Your storehouses will overflow. All of those promises he gave to Israel should they obey him. Now, should they not obey him, ultimately he said he would drive them out into the nations. He will disperse them. In Isaiah chapter 5, he gives the parable of the vineyard. From Isaiah's point of view, Jesus elaborates on the parable of the vineyard. But in Isaiah, the parable of the vineyard basically says, because there was no rightful leadership over the vineyard being Israel, God would destroy the vat, and the entire vineyard would be destroyed. The tower that he built in the vineyard, he will lay down. That tower is synonymous with the temple. So God declared that because of the unfaithfulness of Israel, he would destroy his vineyard, Israel being his vineyard, and the temple, and the vat. The vat is a picture of the sacrificial order, the korbanot. So this is what God did. The Babylonians, of course, in 586 BC. Before that, you had in the northern kingdom the Assyrians, 722 BC. Then ultimately you had the Romans. Mm-hmm. Now the Romans under Titus did an incredible thing, and the Romans, you see this, the prophet talks about how God will raise up the nations to implement judgment, but they will go too far. And that he will judge the nations for going too far with his purpose for them, and his purpose for the nations. In other words, his purpose for Rome at that time was to be that instrument of his judgment, of his chastisement. But then remember, he said, but they will go too far and he will judge them. So what did Titus begin to do? Titus was up to here with the Jewish people, with the Jewish nation. So what did he do? He determined that he would plow the Temple Mount. He would just raise it, and every stone will lay in the dirt. That's one determination. Secondly, he decided that he would destroy all genealogy. Everyone's genealogy would be completely wiped out. Why? Because he wanted to be sure that there would not be a Jewish nation following what he did. And then the third thing he did was, sort of as a curse to the land, he named the land Aelia Palestina. He dubbed the land Aelia Palestina at that time. So we're talking about 70 AD. Titus was quite a tyrant. And so he did those three things. And his whole purpose was to ensure that there would never be a Jewish nation again. Now we know that that was not God's determination. Right? We know that Titus went too far. It was God's determination. Jesus said it. The destruction that was coming upon Jerusalem in Luke chapter 21 was vengeance, the time of vengeance that God spoke about, that the prophets spoke about. In fact, when he said that these are the days of vengeance mentioned by the prophets, he was pointing back to Leviticus chapter 26 at Mount Sinai. God said that he would drive Israel out. All right. But Titus went too far. And he decided that he's going to erase Israel. There will be no more Israel going forward. And then he died. All right. So, but he was wrong.
And we're still feeling the repercussions, right?
Yep.
Because we wouldn't have the ignorant claiming Israel
absolutely.
as Palestine.
So that's the curse of Titus.
Yep.
In fact, we can look at what's happening today in Israel, and we can call that the curse of Titus. Titus's curse. So he did that. All right. But he's going to, well, I'm not going to say he's going to pay a high price because he's already paying a high price.
Yeah.
So this is what Titus did. Nevertheless, Israel was driven out into the nation, 70 AD. The process didn't come to a completion in 70 AD. 70 AD was the beginning of the process, because for at least 150 years, the Jewish people would not stay out of the land. Right. They kept coming back in, and the Romans would have to come in and push them back out. Ultimately, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, the destruction at Masada and so on, the Jewish people said, okay, we're defeated, and they pulled away. But they kept coming back in small trickles. But they conceded to the fact that they were defeated. And most of them, some say most of them went to Babylon. I think most of them actually went to North Africa after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Babylon became a hotspot at that time, and so it was more convenient, more safe for them just to go to Egypt and then to North Africa. Ultimately, they would make their way, many of them, into North Africa all the way over to the Straits of Gibraltar, and then ultimately into Spain and Portugal. So the vast majority of them ended up in Spain and Portugal. But you see, that the diaspora really began in earnest in 722 BC. It basically took place in three phases. The final phase, 70 AD, and the maybe a couple hundred years following that is when it really began to set in. Now, this was God's work. God determined that Israel would be driven out. He did not determine that the nations would drive them. and do what Titus did. The curse of Titus is what we're seeing today. So that's where we are. And what happened? They stayed in the diaspora, mostly Babylon, Spain, Portugal, some in northeast Europe, not many. Ultimately, much of the dispersion from Babylon and Spain ended up in northeast Europe that became known as the Ashkenazi Jewish movement. But most of the Jews at that time were in North Africa, Spain, Portugal, some even in Italy and France, and then ultimately in Babylon and so on. Some did travel further east and go into places like Kashmir, the Kashmir area, even some into China. Nevertheless, they were completely dispersed. And that lasted from about 200 AD all the way up to the 1500s. What happened in the 1500s? Well, Spain and Portugal decided that they would expel their Jews.
Yep.
So King Alfonso of Portugal, hungering for he was ambitious. He wanted to rule all of Iberia. So he married into the family of the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Her name was Isabella. He married her, and as a result of that marriage, they made a pact with Alfonso, and their pact that they made with him, Isabella and Ferdinand, is that he would forcibly convert his Jews like they did and expel the ones who would not convert. So this was the condition after the expulsion edict in 1492. Many of the Jews that were driven out of Spain, many if not most of them, ended up in the Ottoman Empire. Because right at the same time that this was happening, the Ottoman Empire was growing in strength and actually had defeated the Mamluks and had defeated some of the other Muslim tribes and had grown into a credible empire under the rule of the Sultan Suleiman the Great, as they refer to him. So here is Spain now expelling their Jews, and I'm talking about hundreds and thousands of Jews. And they're all filtering into the Ottoman Empire. What's happening? Well, ultimately, many of those Jews would actually factor into the land of Israel. So because of the Sultan Suleiman, the Ottoman Empire, and because of the failings of Spain and Portugal to maintain and to keep their Jews began to return to the land of Israel. And that happened ultimately in Portugal because Alfonso couldn't keep his Jews to be Christians. He brought them out to cathedrals, right? Hundreds and thousands of them on one day, and he sprinkled holy water on hundreds of thousands of Jews, and immediately they become they're Christians, right? That didn't work. And so after a few years, he had to end up driving them out, compelling them to either be Christians or go. So where did the vast majority of them go? They ended up in places like Antwerp, places in Northern Europe, and then eventually they began to slowly filter into the Ottoman Empire. So, the Sultan Suleiman famously said that to Spain, your loss is my gain, and Spain was foolish to expel their Jews. So the Suleiman, his attitude was, bring them.
Sure.
Right.
My kingdom, we can use them. And so, as a result of this now, you had so many Jews, and it was all God's arrangement. God gave victory to Suleiman. And a lot of people don't give Suleiman credit, or they don't acknowledge him. But in Jewish history, he's acknowledged, he's well acknowledged as a righteous Gentile almost. He's like Cyrus, because he kind of initiated that by his allowance of Jews to come into the Ottoman Empire. He initiated a process that would ultimately lead to an ingathering. And that ingathering is still in the process today. So when did he make that determination? In 1517. 1517, he basically said, bring your Jews. We want them. Let them come in. And as they began to come into the Ottoman Empire, into Turkey, into other parts of that area, Asia Minor, they obviously began to filter southwards. And then you have great Jewish leaders that was promoting the process of the return to the land of Israel. Israel at that time in the 1500s was a very difficult place. There were swamps, there were, malaria, there were all kinds of setbacks and impediments. The people were hostile and so on, so it was a difficult place. But nevertheless, very slowly, Jews from Spain and Portugal and other parts of the Jewish world began to filter into the land. Now, there is one person I would like to bring to light now. Her name is Donna Garcia Mendez of the House of Mendez.
Yes.
Donna Garcia Nasi of the House of Mendez. Very, very, very wealthy woman. In fact, she was, at that time, the wealthiest person. The wealthiest person in the world at that time in terms of her individual wealth. She had inherited that from her husband who had died. He was a spice trader. Because the Portuguese had sailed the Cape of Good Hope and had found a way to the Indian Ocean, Vasco da Gama, Bartolome Diaz, Mendez now was reaping the benefits of that discovery, and he was bringing back black pepper by the galleons full, and he became rich. And then his wife inherited all that money, Donna Garcia. Now, what happened? She had to leave Portugal. She was forcibly converted, like the hundreds of thousands of Jews in Portugal. She was forcibly converted. She was one of the people that got sprinkled on and deemed to be a Christian. Well, she wasn't, like the vast majority of them. So what happened? Because of her wealth, because of her power, she arranged a meeting with the Sultan Suleiman, and they made an agreement that his kingdom would become through his power, there would be a passage all the way from the Netherlands into the land of Israel. And she paid for that. She positioned herself and she politicked for it, and she succeeded. And of course, with her wealth, she also financed a lot of the building up, the very early periods of the building up of the land of Israel. She poured tons of money into the building up of Safed. She purchased Tiberias.
Yeah.
And
the whole town.
She paid for. She purchased the whole place.
Right.
Yeah.
She owned Tiberias, and she gave it over to the Jews that were coming in from Spain and Portugal. So you can go to Tiberias today, and Spanish, or Ladino actually, which is Portuguese, Spanish, and Hebrew. Ladino is a language that's spoken there now. They have synagogues in Tiberias that speak in Ladino today. So, and that's because of what she did. She also financed the building of synagogues in Jerusalem, scholastic centers. She even began to finance the Jewish community, the small Jewish community in Hebron. So she did a lot, and there were many benefactors like her that were working together to initiate that process of what would become the ingathering, and that's what it was. Now we're talking the mid 1500s, right? This process really began to build in momentum, but it built slowly, and a couple hundred years later, in the 1700s, it began to pick up more momentum. The land began to become more embracing of the Jewish exiles that were coming in. So what happened, I believe, and so does any Zionist, I think, so will any Zionist, that God began to, as the Jewish people began to return, the people of Israel began to return, slowly and gradually, the land began to become more hospitable, more open for them, and that process only developed more and more. So by the mid-1800s, you have a real force of an ingathering that had began to occur, mid-1800s. So I'm not talking about an exodus like what we see in the book of Exodus. I'm talking about a gradual build towards what we're seeing today. So the mid-1800s is when the ingathering process began to be recognized, particularly by the Arab world, the Muslim world. Mid-1800s, the globalists that we know today didn't exist, but there were preliminary movements in the mid-1800s stemmed from the so-called Illuminati and so on, that were beginning to pay attention to this process, that yes, Jews were in fact beginning to filter into the land of Israel. And this was alarming to the globalists, even in the late 1800s. And this, of course, was alarming to the Muslims at that time. So by the late 1800s, the process was notable. it seemed to be unstoppable. And that's around the time, late 1800s, early 1900s, when there was sort of an effort on the part of the nations and even on the part of Islam, certainly on the part of Islam, to begin to impede the process. What happened at the end? Well, at the beginning of the 1900s, you had World War I.
Right.
World War I, of course, brought an end to the Ottoman Empire, right?
Yeah.
So that favor that they were receiving from the Ottoman Empire ceased.
Right.
Nevertheless, it didn't stop the process. Over the years, up until the 1930s, you have again a very tepid but a consistent flow of Jewish people coming into the land of Israel. And then, of course, World War II, the Nazis. So what happened with the Nazis was pivotal in the ingathering process, because Jews from Europe, leading up to the Nazi terror, some saw clearly that things were going to just go completely crazy in Europe. They saw it. They saw the anti-Semitism building among the socialists in Germany. The Nazis were socialists. They were leftists, right?
Right.
A lot of people think that
Yeah,
the Nazis were right-wing.
But they weren't. They were. It was the National Socialist Party.
Yeah, they were leftists. So a lot of Jews in Europe, particularly around Hamburg and Germany, began to recognize that this is not a good movement. These socialists are anti-Semite, and many of them chose to go to Israel. So the exodus to Israel really began to build momentum in the 1930s. Of course, the late 1930s, we have the Nazi terror. World War II came into being.
Right.
And then, following World War II, of course, 1948, we have a giant leap in the process of the ingathering of Israel, which was, of course, the War of Independence and the recognition of the State of Israel. We talk about the Balfour Declaration as if that was done gleefully. A lot of the globalists, in fact, all of the globalists, I would say, wasn't in favor of that declaration.
Yeah.
There were righteous men in Parliament in England, in the United Kingdom, that promoted that whole declaration. And it was necessary, it was good. And so now you have the State of Israel in 1948. From that point on,
England had to get their hands off of Israel. It was
They were
they were meddling
and
with
screaming,
God's chosen.
Yeah, they were brought kicking and screaming to the Balfour Declaration.
But there's always been in England a fairly conservative Israel-favoring government.
Yes.
Always Benjamin Disraeli. He was Prime Minister of England in the 1800s, and at that time there was a strong pro-Israel movement in England that led to the Balfour Declaration. That doesn't exist today.
No,
Right.
Doesn't exist today.
Yep.
England is not near the country or the nation that they were, 200 years ago. Nevertheless, so the process of the ingathering now is well on its way up to 1948. And then, of course, you had several wars, and then, of course, the Six-Day War, 1967.
Right.
So at that point, Israel was still struggling as a fledgling nation, but then they won that war handily.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they won it, but God, He lifted up a standard.
Right.
That's part of the standard. Yeah. That's the ensign. That's the ensign that we talked about. He lifted up an ensign and said to Israel and said to the nations, I'm involved. Mm-hmm. This is the second ingathering. I will bring them back a second time with His hand. Who's doing it? God's doing it. So verse 11 again, latter part of verse 11. I will again recover the second time with my hand, with His hand, the remnant of His people. So that's what happened. That standard was lifted up in 1948. It was that flag, that banner was waved mightily in 1967. You have the war of attrition. You had the Yom Kippur War. The banner was still waving. And so now we have an incredible war. This war is unlike the other wars before it. The victory that Israel is gaining for herself is nothing like has ever been seen. I mean, the Six-Day War was tough, 6 days, and it wasn't like this, where thousands upon thousands of combatants were destroyed relatively quickly. Now, of course, there are people that are crying about the Palestinians, and no one likes to think that innocent people died. But the harsh reality is Israel was overly careful and has been overly careful with this war, the 10-7 war, and has been incredibly effective, much more effective than in any other war that they've fought since 1948. God is certainly involved in this war, and we're going to hear about the miracles as time goes along. We're going to hear about those miracles, and there are miracles. For instance, the miracle of Javier Meli, that's a miracle.
Yep.
And God made that abundantly clear to everyone. That's part of the standard. That's part of the nest, the ensign that God is raising up. What is the nature of the ensign? The nature of the ensign, the nature of this banner is God has a commitment to his people Israel. His son is in the process of redeeming. It was given to him to redeem Israel. And too many Christians are not aware of this. The process of the ingathering of Israel is the work of Jesus. We tend to think of the work of Jesus only as the work of the cross. Well, the work on the cross was everything. It was everything. I don't take anything away from the work of the cross. It was everything. But because of his appointment to bring about redemption, and because he succeeded on the cross to provide that redemption, he is able to redeem Israel. Salvation, my salvation, happened because of the cross. The redemption of Israel is happening because of the cross. And he's the one that's executing it. You know, the Lord says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make my enemies a footstool for you. Rule in the midst. So the war psalm, Psalm 110, is exactly about this. Now, I have a particular person that's now rushing me, bombarding me on Facebook, on our church's Facebook. And I think she's posted about 90-something comments so far. And very hostile, very ugly, very aggressive. But I'm responding to her. Earlier today, I figured I would leave this person alone. But then I said, no, I'm going to keep responding to this person because the level of hatred, the level of animus that I sense in this person has to be demonic. And the fact that this person is persisting might indicate that this person is to be saved. So I'm going to keep on this person until something gives. But there is this idea among the nations now that you know, Israel is this malevolent nation, and they're being incredibly they're evil. You know, this one person is saying that us, we serve Satan because the God of the Old Testament is Satan, and the God of Israel is Satan, but not Jesus. She's a Christian. This person is a Christian. So that sentiment is that what I just said to you is way out there, but not so far out there, because many Christians in their heart of hearts feel the same way, and they do. So today this person, the last comment was that Jesus was not a liberal. Oh no, excuse me. Jesus was a liberal. He wasn't an evangelical like you. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I want to respond to that. But you see, so people are beginning to stand up against Israel. What are they doing? They're recognizing the ensign and they're rejecting it. They're rejecting God's ensign to the nations, that his son is bringing about redemption. And that's what this is all about. Yeshua, Jesus, is bringing about redemption. And many will resist it. Many will stand against it. But Jeremiah said something that's pivotal, and we need to see this. And this is the God of the Old Testament. This is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus. He says this. In fact, Jesus, speaking on his behalf, said this in Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 10. Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare in the coastlands afar off. That's where we are. We're on a coastland. Florida is a coastland. Declare in the coastlands far off and say, he who scattered Israel will gather him and keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. So the one who scattered Israel is the one who will bring Israel back. This is the nature of that ensign that God is raising up for all the nations to see. What is a travesty is this. Many religious Christians will not see this. Many religious Christians will strive against this. And to their own destruction, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So here we are, the Exodus, the Exodus that we're talking about, to answer the question, yes, there is an Exodus. And the Exodus today is about 509 years old. It began in 1517. That's when it began. Started off very slow and tepid, but the momentum built as time went along. And so here we are today. And now there are more Jews in the land of Israel than outside of the land of Israel. And I predict, this is not prophecy, you can't say prophecy, but I predict that in the next 3 or 4 years, we will see even more Jews by the hundreds of thousands.
Oh, absolutely.
Entering into the land of Israel.
Well, the level of anti-Semitism that we're starting to see is going to drive them there.
Yeah. There's a prophecy that Obadiah gave, the one chapter of Obadiah. At the end of the prophecy, he said, concerning the restoration of Israel, this time, he said, the outcast, the dispersed of Jerusalem, will return from Sepharad and inhabit the Negev. So, the Negev is being taken by Israel right now.
Yep.
Right? When you think of the Negev, what stands in front of the Negev, between the Negev and the Mediterranean Ocean?
Gaza.
Yeah.
Gaza stands between the Negev and the Mediterranean Ocean.
We were there this last trip, and it's
Yep.
blooming,
Right there.
green, amazing.
But you don't have many communities in the Negev.
No, well,
So-
it's been barren for so long.
based on the prophecy of Obadiah, the outcasts of Jerusalem, those who were driven out of Jerusalem, and I believe he's pointing to 70 AD, will come from Sepharad. And Sepharad there is Spain and Portugal, Iberia.
Sure.
And they will inhabit the cities of the Negev. So Spain and Portugal, just 5 years ago, opened their borders for Jews to return to Spain and Portugal. That's the work of the devil. That's a counter by the devil.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because the devil fully understands that there is a movement happening in the Americas that's frightening to him, which is the descendants of Sepharad, the outcasts of Jerusalem, are beginning to return spiritually. There's a movement in the Americas, in Brazil, in New Mexico, Texas, all the way to Chile. It's called, the Beni Anusim. These are the sons of those who were coerced, so-called descendants of the Marranos. This movement is real. Again, Israel is grappling to deal with this, and they're sending rabbis to Mexico. They're sending rabbis to Brazil and to other Latin countries, and they're trying to figure out, how do we embrace these masses of people that wants to reconnect with their ancestral faith? This is happening. That's part of the ingathering. How can that not be part of the ingathering? You're talking about the rabbis in Israel are now discovering that there's an estimated over 55 million Brazilians that are over 85% Jewish, their DNA. How do you deal with that? If even a tenth of that 55 million were to make conversion and aliyah, think about that. Think about that number. What's a tenth of what's 10% of 55 million? You're talking roughly 5 million.
Still 5 million, 55.
And that's only Brazil. We're not talking Mexico. We're not talking the rest of Latin America. But this is a real movement. So yes, the Exodus is ongoing. It's not complete. And more, this Exodus is going to build up to a crescendo. And when it happens, it's going to be astonishing. This is the end sign that God is raising up. He's going to shock the nations. Isn't that what Isaiah said? He'll lift up an end sign to the nations and for the nations to see.
So something occurs to me. In the end times, we, Christians, have to flock to the banner, right? The banner's there for us to see it.
We are the banner.
Okay.
And that's how we would end the question. The end of the question is, how can we prepare now? We are part of that banner. You know what it says in the Tanakh? Where is the Tanakh? It's very interesting. In the Tanakh now, in regards to Isaiah chapter 11, and Jim, I'll let you read it. I can't see this. You can probably see better than I can. I'm just struggling now. All right, so in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10. Read that first. I can read, but you read that first in verse 10. And what you're going to realize is it's different than what's in the King James. It's different than what's in the New American Standard. And I researched it as best as I could in a lexicon, Hebrew English lexicon. And that's correct. That's more correct than what we see in the New American Standard. Let me read it again in the New American Standard, Jim, and we'll compare it to what's in the Tanakh, in the actual Hebrew.
11 verse 10?
Yeah. So read 11 verse 10 for us. And I'll read 11 verse 10 in the New American Standard.
I don't understand how this breaks down.
Okay, let me...
I'm not finding verse 10.
Remember the Tanakh
It's
was
right to
right to
left.
left.
With the Hebrew.
Right.
In that day, the stock of Jesse, Yishai,
The stock of Jesse. So you think, okay, the stock of Jesse is Yeshua. But aren't we a part of that?
Right.
Yep.
Aren't we the stock of Yeshua? So I like the Hebrew because it's talking about the stock.
Right.
What does the word stock mean? Inventory. Those, what's stored up of Jesse. Go ahead.
The stock of Jesse that has remained standing shall become a standard to the peoples. Nations shall seek his counsel, and his abode shall be honored. In that day my Lord will apply his hand again
The second time. Right.
to redeeming the other part of his people
So
from
that's
Assyria.
verse 11. So verse 10 is powerful in the actual Hebrew.
Sure.
And it's significant because in the New American Standard it simply says, then in that day the nations will restore to the root of Jesse. That's wrong.
Yeah.
The New American Standard is wrong.
Totally different.
Wow.
What it says
Connotation.
there in the actual Hebrew is more powerful. The stock of Jesse. And I believe that's, to answer your question, that's who we are.
Well, and
We should, of course, we should recognize the banner, but we are the ones to wave the banner.
And it says that remains standing,
That
implying
remains
that there will
applying,
those,
standing, that we will stand in those days.
Yeah.
So we will be the ones waving the flag. When you look at an army like Hitler's army, for instance, just Hitler, the Germans, Nazis, they were big on ensigns, banners, right?
Yep.
Banners
Yep.
was everything.
with their swastika on
And
The
they
Romans
believed-
were, too.
And
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
course, he was the Third Reich, right? He was
Yes, right.
So banners are significant, and ancient armies would always carry their banner because the banner represents the authority under which they're coming into battle.
Right.
Well, we are the ones to carry the banner. We are the ones lifting that banner, and the banner really is the redemption that Yeshua, the root of Jesse, is bringing about in the earth. And it's about the restoration of Israel. He's going to bring them back from everywhere, the remnant of his people who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Patros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamat, and from the islands of the sea. This is the restoration process. So yes, there is an exodus, and the exodus is real. It's more real than any other exodus that we've seen in the past as it relates to the ingathering of Israel. This is it. This is the big one. Again, it started off over 500 years ago, very slowly, tepidly, but has built momentum and will build more momentum towards the end. You talk about the valley of dry bones, Ezekiel chapter 37. My goodness, what will be if the rabbis that are flocking to these Latin countries were to succeed in causing these people to revert back to their ancestral faith as they desire to, and they desire for it. Their desires for it. Half of them were to do this. You're talking multiple millions. This is the valley of dry bones. This is happening. 25 years ago, prophetically, God showed that to me. Of course, that's meaningful to me because I come from the stock of the Beni Anosim, but I'm not looking to be a Jew. This is my work. My work is in Messiah.
Right.
But for the ones that are returning, that are reverting, I shouldn't even use the word revert. What's a better word? To revert implies a decline or something, right?
Or a dimension of conversion.
Returning. Let's say they
Returning.
return to
Sure.
their ancestral faith.
Sure.
The ones that are doing this, you should hear some of these testimonies. Now, some of the testimonies are just phenomenal. There is an awakening, a deep soul awakening in Brazil and Latin countries around the world, and children and people, old people, they're all asking these questions. It's almost like they're clamoring to identify with Israel. And again, the rabbis in Israel are perplexed, but they're engaged. This is the fulfillment of what Obadiah saw. This is the fulfillment of Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 10. The one who scattered Israel will bring them back. What a miracle that would be, that tens of millions of descendants of the Sephardim would return to their ancestral faith and return to the land of Israel and build up the Negev. What a miracle that would be. The Valley of Dry Bones is what we're talking about. So, there's an exodus going on today, and it's happening right under our noses. Many people are not aware of it. Well, as Bibi said, they should be ashamed.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
We are living in perhaps the most exciting time in all of humanity. Jesus said concerning these times that there would be no other time like it, before or after. I believe that statement also applies to what is positive about this time. And what is positive about this time is there's a restoration, a real restoration. Miracles are happening. God is doing this, and we ought to recognize it. We ought to put away our Christian prejudices and stop thinking, oh, that's the Jews, that cannot be God. God's not working with the Jews because he only works with us. We're his favorites. We're Christians after all. We need to put away that ideology because it's wrong. God is committed to the people of Israel, has been. From Mount Sinai, he stated his commitment from the very beginning. He said, if you persist in sin, Israel, I will drive you out. I will drive you out into the nations. I will give the land its Sabbaths. But then, at the end of that process, I will bring you back and I will restore you. So here we are. We're seeing that. We're seeing with our own eyes that restoration. We should be rejoicing. We should be ecstatic about this. We should be involved. We're the ones to lift up that banner for all the nations to see.
That's our program. If these questions raise other questions in your thinking, you are welcome to share them with us. The easiest way for you to do that is to email us at voice@buildupzion.org. Again, voice@buildupzion.org. And until next week, Shalom.